The secret government plan to create a stock market hyperbubble before the election. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the TGA, which is the Treasury General Account. And if you thought the repo market was insane, you need to sit down and buckle up because it is properly stiff drink time. That is for sure. So the TGA, the Treasury General Account, prior to 2008 used to be in the commercial banking system. So for this example, we'll say the government has their TGA with Bank A. Well, the government needs to spend some money, so they'll issue treasuries at auction. That goes into the treasury market, and everyday people, financial institutions, hedge funds buy those treasuries. So it looks a little bit like this. We've got your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam needing some spending money. So he sells those treasuries, and your friend and family member Fred and this new guy right here, hedge fund Hank, they buy the treasuries from Sam. So those treasuries come down, they go on to the balance sheet of Fred and Hank. Fred and Hank pay Sam some money, and that money goes into the TGA. And let's assume for this example, the government has their account with Bank A, Fred has his account with Bank B, and Hank has his account with Bank C. So let's go through the balance sheets to see how this transaction happened. What happened to the bank's balance sheets and the balance sheet of the Fed? Because remember, all of the dealer banks and the banks under the Fed's umbrella have their reserve accounts held with the Fed. It's very important you understand that, and we'll explain it further in just a moment. So let's say the TGA started with $100 in the bank. So their deposits, their checking account would have $100, and Bank A would have $100 in reserves. Fred started with $50 in the bank, so $50 of deposits, $50 in reserves, and hedge fund Hank started with $150 in deposits. Therefore, the bank had $150 in reserves. But they bought these treasuries, remember? So Fred and Hank had to take money out of their deposits, out of their checking accounts. So once the transaction was finished, then the Treasury General Account, had $150 in it. So $150 in deposits, $150 in reserves. And we'll just assume that Fred and Hank both bought $25 worth of treasuries. So let me back up here, start again so everybody's on the same page. So Fred, Hank buy $25 each of treasuries. That means the TGA goes to $150 because they now have an extra $50 in cash. So what happens is the deposit, the checking account for Fred goes down by $25, and the checking account for Hank goes down by $25 as well. What happened in this process with the reserves held at the Fed? Absolutely nothing. When we started, there was $300 in reserves. 100, 50, and 150, equaling $300. When we finished the transaction, meaning after Fred and Hank bought the treasuries from your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, there's still $300 in reserves held at the Fed because the reserves in total didn't change. They just switched hands. So looking at the reserve accounts with these banks held at the Fed, they started with $100, $50, and $150. That matches up the reserves over here. And you'll have to forgive me for just a moment because I did them in blue here just to show that they're assets, but here I did them in red. I know it gets a little confusing. I did them red here because it's a liability of the Fed. But these reserves that you see in blue are the same reserves you see here in red. So going back, we started with Bank A having 100, Bank B having 50, and C having 150, 300 total. Then after the transaction, A had 150 in reserves, B had 25, C had 125. Again, it equals $300. The main key for this part of the step is to understand, regardless of what happens in the commercial banking system, transactions between each entity doesn't affect the amount of reserves held at the Fed. Again, they just change hands and go from one account to another account. And one more thing I'd like to point out when I'm talking about these transactions between the entities in the real economy with the commercial banking system, I'm not only talking about transactions like buying treasuries, but also when people like hedge fund Hank and your friend and family member Fred pay their taxes, the exact same process happens. The deposits with B and C go down, and prior to 2008, the deposits of A would go up because that's where the TGA was, but the reserves don't change at all. So now going over to what happened after 2008, this is where it starts to get really interesting. To find out and take a deeper dive into what happened during the GFC, let's go right to the New York Fed's website. When the Fed's credit policies caused its balance sheet to expand rapidly in September 2008, meaning there was way too many reserves in the system because the Fed started printing all of this funny money during the GFC, the Treasury took the first of two steps to offset the effects, meaning the Treasury was helping the Fed by draining some of the excess liquidity from the system. And if it doesn't make sense right now, don't worry about it. I'm going to explain it in more detail on the whiteboard in just a moment. Specifically, it launched the Supplementary Financing Program, SFP, a sale of Treasury bills to the public, and deposited the proceeds in a new SFP account at the Fed. In other words, it took the money from the sale of the Treasury bills, and instead of depositing it in the commercial banking system, they now deposited it with a TGA set up with the Federal Reserve. The SFP was designed to drain some of the reserves that the Fed's liquidity programs, in other words, QE and the bailouts, were creating, and to prevent the federal funds rate from plummeting. So basically what happened in 2008 is the Treasury moved their bank account from the commercial banking system over to the Fed to help them manage the excess reserves the Fed was creating by printing all this funny money for bailouts and quantitative easing. So now the TGA isn't with Bank A, they're with the Fed under their umbrella. So what does this do to the reserves in the system? Well, we'll go back to our original example where we have Hank and Fred buying $50 worth of treasuries from your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam. In other words, the government or the Treasury. So we start with $300 in the system. We still have $300, but now, since the TGA is removed from the commercial banking system, there's only $200 in bank reserves, right? Because we've got $100 with the TGA, 50 with Bank B, and 150 with Bank C. So the big change is what's happened is the Treasury has a lot of control over the amount of reserves in the banking system. So let's walk through the transaction. We start with $200 in bank reserves in the system that the banks have access to. Then if the government sells $50 worth of treasuries, the reserves in the banking system go down by $50 because the $50 goes over to the TGA account, which again is now removed from the commercial banking system. And the opposite happens if the Treasury spends money into the economy. So when they sell debt or sell treasuries, they're taking reserves out of the system. When they spend money into the economy, they're creating more reserves in the system. And you may be saying to yourself, man, George, if the Treasury has the ability to make the bank reserves in the system go up and down like that, it sounds a lot like what the Fed does with quantitative easing and quantitative tightening. Exactly. You're starting to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And just wait till we get to step number 2. That's when your mind is really going to be blown. Step number 2, the TGA, the economy, and the stock market. Let's check out a chart of what the TGA looks like right now. We start at 2000, go all the way to 2020. And if you'll notice the chart, editor, go ahead and throw that up. It goes all the way back to 1988, but prior to 2000, it's flatline. It doesn't do anything. As a matter of fact, prior to 2008, it pretty much doesn't do anything. Then in 2008, everything changes. That's when their account went to the Fed, and you notice it starts going up and down and up and down. And it doesn't look like much on this chart, but that's because this chart goes from 0 all the way up to 1.6 trillion. But if you looked at this chart just as of maybe 30 days ago or 60 days ago, all these moves would have seemed really significant because the chart only went from 0 to about 600 billion. So everything has changed now. Once Trump got elected, notice the TGA started to go up, and then it just comes crashing all the way down. And again, it doesn't seem like a lot on this chart, but it was huge at the time because then the TGA was over $400 billion. So they would have had to have spent $300 billion into the economy in a matter of just a couple weeks. Keep in mind, quantitative easing, QE3, was about $80 billion a month. So this would have been like 3 or 4 QEs all at one time. It makes you wonder if Trump didn't find out about the TGA right around here. But that's for a whole completely separate video. So it goes down, then it comes back up during the repo crisis in September of 2019. But since we've had the cerveza sickness and the Fed has come in with all of these 4 and 5 letter programs to add more liquidity to the system, QE infinity, the TGA has gone through the roof. It's almost at $1.6 trillion right now. And think about how massive that number is compared to what it was prior to 2008. If you look at this chart, and it's on the Fed's website, you'll see the TGA generally fluctuated between maybe $2 and $5 billion. Let me repeat, between $2 and $5 billion. Now, it's almost 1.6 trillion. And let's remember that quantitative easing is increasing the amount of bank reserves in the system. That's the net effect. When the TGA spends money, when the government spends money into the economy, they're also increasing bank reserves. So basically, this is another form of quantitative easing. And when the TGA doesn't spend, when they allow their account to continue to grow, collect money, this reduces the amount of bank reserves in the system, or it's just like the Fed doing quantitative tightening. Now let's take it to the next step. We know that quantitative easing has the tendency to increase stock prices. They don't have to go up. I want to be clear. It just has the tendency to raise stock prices. A lot of people get that mixed up. They think that if the Fed does QE and increases bank reserves, the stock market automatically goes up, like it's a light switch. Not necessarily, because the primary dealer banks still have to take action. So if there's more reserves in the system, they'll have more capacity on their balance sheet or more flexibility and freedom to loan money to hedge funds and financial institutions that will take the money and buy stocks, lifting the value of the overall stock market or whichever stocks they're actually buying. So just to reiterate, the Fed doesn't have complete control over the stock market going up or down. It's really in the hands of the primary dealer banks, the hedge funds, and the financial institutions. If they don't think they can make money buying stocks, they're not going to do it regardless of how many bank reserves they have in the system. But from a psychological standpoint, all of these entities, all these market participants believe there's a Fed put. So it's this very weird cycle, and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy that just because these entities think the Fed has their back, the Fed has their back just because whenever they do something, these people actually take an action. It's like a Pavlovian dog effect that whenever you ring the bell, they start to salivate. It's the same thing with the Fed. Whenever they do QE, the banks, the primary dealers, the hedge funds, financial institutions just buy stocks. It's again, a very weird system. That's why I said at the beginning of the video, you gotta buckle up for this one. Definitely stiff drink time. So the next question becomes, if the TGA has gone Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond, gone completely parabolic, just off the charts, why haven't stocks gone down? Why haven't the excess reserves in the banking system gone down? Because when the TGA doesn't spend, their bank account goes up and up and up, but that sucks reserves out of the system. So editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of the excess reserves in the system right now. You'll see it goes parabolic as well. The same thing for the Fed's balance sheet and the M2 money supply in the real economy. So the Treasury sits back and says, listen, if the Fed is going to produce all these excess bank reserves and prevent the stock market from going down, then why don't we collect money and just build this war chest, this massive bazooka of trillions of dollars that we can spend into the economy at any time we choose. And we know if we spend this into the economy that it'll most likely boost the economy through all this direct spending. Think about the stimulus checks and the increased unemployment that have gone out to all these Americans. They're spending it with a lot of velocity, so they're increasing economic activity. This could be a $1.6 trillion stimulus package right before the election. To understand this further, and just to make sure you know that I'm not the only guy with a tinfoil hat here, let's go to a recent interview with my buddy Luke Gromen.
If we've watched what the Treasury General account has done, while the Fed's been pumping money in on one side, Treasury's been sucking it out in the same staggering rate, really, right? Where the biggest TGA balance like we've ever seen, I think it's been $400 or $420 billion. And it's sitting at $1.45 trillion now. And so historically, when the TGA and the dollar, the Dixie, have been very closely correlated as the Treasury's pulling liquidity out. And so it's been surprising to me. I'm really on both sides. A, that all this liquidity and the interest rate differential collapse and the things that we were just talking about haven't resulted in a weaker dollar. And then on the flip side, I've been watching this TGA going up and up and up. And at some point, that's going to reverse. When it reverses, presumably, you'd be increasing the currency in circulation in the U.S. at like a 60% annual rate or something crazy, right? And I wonder if it isn't just being sterilized for the moment by Treasury, and why Treasury's even doing that. I mean, is it the Trump administration basically trying to hedge themselves against the Fed, where they're saying, all right, well, maybe the Fed will try to make the economy bad and get us out of office, so we're going to stock up this war chest of $1.5 trillion that we can spend in the economy to turbocharge it in the last 3 months before the election.
And if the Treasury were to spend all this money prior to the election, keep in mind, it wouldn't just go into the economy, it would also increase the bank reserves in the system, which would most likely lift the stock market even higher. And we all know right now it's in a huge bubble. So if it continues to go higher and higher and higher based on this funny money that the Treasury is spending into the account, increasing bank reserves, then we're going straight into a hyper bubble. And why would the government do this? Because they want the stock market to go up and they want economic activity to go up right before the election. Oh, time out. I know a lot of you are probably asking yourself, George, how on earth does the Treasury's account continue to go up and up and up when they're doing all of these stimulus programs, the CARES Act, deficit spending? Because they manage it in a way that's very clever. They'll have the money trickle out in the form of these stimulus checks, while at the same time they're collecting all of these taxes and doing these huge auctions where they're issuing a massive amount of treasuries. So although they have money trickling out, they have a lot more money coming in the form of new treasury issuance and tax collection. Step number 3. The end game. We know the government has a way to bypass the Fed, to spend money into the economy, giving it a short-term sugar boost, and potentially increasing the stock market to try to win an election. But it doesn't stop there. As you would imagine, there are huge unintended consequences. Let's dive right into them. We first have to understand there is a significant difference between when the Fed does QE and when the government does QE from the Treasury General Account that we discussed in step 1 and 2. So let's understand how the balance sheets work. That paints a very clear picture. So the Fed starts off with treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, or mortgage-backed sausages, I think is a better term for them. They're on the asset side of the balance sheet. The liabilities, the bank reserves. We've got Bank A, and their assets are reserves, treasuries, and in this case, deposits, so customer deposits, and equity. When the Fed buys treasuries from the bank, that's their version of quantitative easing. The treasuries go from the bank's balance sheet to the Fed's balance sheet. And the Fed increases the bank reserves for the bank for whom they bought the treasuries. So very simple. The treasuries go from Bank A's balance sheet to the Fed's balance sheet. The Fed increases the amount of bank reserves Bank A has. So let's look at what this does to Bank A's balance sheet. They start with reserves and treasuries. After the transaction, they have reserves and reserves, because again, those treasuries went to the Fed's balance sheet. But the deposits in the equity are the exact same. This is key because M2 money supply, meaning the amount of money in the real economy, broad money, hasn't changed at all. The only thing that's changed is the size of the Fed's balance sheet. Contrast that to when the government does quantitative easing. They don't buy treasuries or mortgage-backed securities. They'll spend money into the economy. As an example, they'll send out stimulus checks. So let's say that your friend and family member Fred gets his $1,000 stimulus check right from the government. He is stoked as ever. So he deposits the $1,000 into his bank. Let's say he banks with Bank A as well. So to start, Bank A's balance sheet has reserves and treasuries, deposits and equity. Exact same as our example over here. But after Fred deposits the $1,000 stimulus check into his account, the bank's balance sheet increases. So instead of just having deposits, equity, reserves, treasuries, now they have an additional $1,000 deposit from Fred, and the Fed from the TGA deposits the $1,000 of reserves to back up the $1,000 deposit into the reserve account of Bank A. And keep in mind, this reserve account is held at the Fed. So let me walk through this one more time to make sure everyone is on the same page. The government spends money into the economy. The individuals who receive the money deposit it into their bank account. This increases the amount of deposits in the commercial banking system. And at the same time, the Treasury just deposits the reserves into the bank's reserve account at the Fed. So the balance sheet matches up. We've got an additional 1,000 in reserves and additional 1,000 in deposits. But the key is, in this case, M2 money supply has increased. When the Fed did quantitative easing, M2 money supply stayed the same. So what this means to the average Joe and Jane out there in the real economy, you people watching this video right now, is potentially more demand in the real economy, even if unemployment is going up, because the Treasury is spending this 1.5 into the economy, giving it the short-term sugar rush. So even if unemployment is going up, there could be more money in the back pocket of the average Joe and Jane. They have more spending power. While at the same time, if we look back over the past couple months, we see that supply has shrunk dramatically. If supply continues to decrease while demand increases, this means the prices of what you buy on a day-to-day basis, such as food at the grocery store, will continue to go up. And everyone watching, me included, knows how drastically food prices have gone up over the past couple months. And typically when food prices go up, it leads to social unrest. So is it any surprise we've had rioting, looting of epic magnitudes, almost unprecedented over the past 3-4 weeks, when you look at how high the price of food has gone? Not really. But let's think this through. If the price of food going up has been one of the main underlying issues of all the social unrest we've seen in the United States, and the food prices going up were a result of additional government spending, creating more demand and less supply of goods and services in the economy, what's going to happen to social unrest, rioting, and looting when the Treasury spends $1.5 trillion in a month or two before the election? That will send consumer prices to unimaginable levels, along with social unrest. So I know I said at the beginning of this video that it's stiff drink time, but now, especially if the Treasury tries to do what I think they might try to do to win the election, it goes from stiff drink time to Smith & Wesson time. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.